In the world of global wealth, few names carry the mystique, controversy, and sheer scale of ambition quite like Roman Abramovich. He is a man who rose from an orphaned childhood, in the frozen industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, to become one of the most powerful oligarchs on the planet. A man whose yachts are longer than football pitches, whose art collection rivals national museums, and whose name became synonymous with both footballing glory and geopolitical scandal. This is the story of a fortune built in the chaos of a collapsing empire, spent in the glittering capitals of the West, and ultimately shaken by a war that redrew the map of who was welcome in that world. Roman Arkadyevich Abramovich was born on October 24, 1966, in Saratov, a city on the Volga River in the Soviet Union. His early life was marked by tragedy. His mother died when he was just a toddler, and his father passed away a few years later, leaving young Roman to be raised by relatives in the far northern region of Komi, near the Arctic Circle. It was a childhood defined by hardship rather than privilege, a stark contrast to the opulence that would later define his adult life. There were no early signs of the empire he would build, only a boy learning to survive in one of the harshest, most unforgiving corners of the Soviet Union. As a young man, Abramovich enrolled in technical and industrial institutes, though he never completed a formal degree at some of them. What he did have was an instinct for opportunity, an instinct that would prove far more valuable than any diploma once the Soviet Union began to crumble in the late 1980s. As the command economy loosened its grip, black markets and small trading operations sprang up across the country. Abramovich started small, reportedly selling plastic ducks and toys out of his apartment, then moving into trading oil products smuggled out of refineries. It was unglamorous, often illegal by Soviet standards, and dangerous, but it taught him the two skills that would define his career: how to move fast and how to build relationships with people who controlled resources. The real turning point came with the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Where others saw chaos, Abramovich saw opportunity on a scale that had never existed before. The Russian state was privatizing enormous industrial assets, oil fields, refineries, and metal plants that had once belonged to the Soviet government, often for a fraction of their true value. This period, sometimes called the Wild East of Russian capitalism, created a new class of instant billionaires almost overnight. Abramovich, still in his 20s, positioned himself at the center of this transformation. He became involved in the oil trade, eventually partnering with the powerful and controversial businessman Boris Berezovsky. Together, they orchestrated one of the most consequential deals in modern Russian economic history: the acquisition of Sibneft, a massive state oil company, through the notorious loans for shares scheme of the mid-1990s. Under this arrangement, a handful of well-connected businessmen effectively loaned money to the cash-strapped Russian government in exchange for shares in state companies, with the near-certain expectation that the government would default and the shares would become theirs outright. It was a scheme that critics have long called one of the greatest transfers of public wealth into private hands in modern history, and Abramovich, still in his 20s, walked away, controlling one of the country's largest oil producers. What set Abramovich apart from many of his fellow oligarchs was not just his business acumen, but his political instincts. He cultivated a close relationship with the Kremlin, first under President Boris Yeltsin, and later under Vladimir Putin. He was reportedly instrumental in smoothing the path for Putin's rise to the presidency at the turn of the millennium. And unlike Berezovsky, who eventually fell out with Putin and fled into exile, Abramovich managed to maintain his position and his fortune. He served for several years as the governor of Chukotka, a remote and impoverished region in Russia's Far East, where he poured enormous personal wealth into infrastructure, schools, and hospitals, an unusual philanthropic gesture that some saw as genuine civic investment and others viewed as a calculated effort to maintain political goodwill. By the early 2000s, Abramovich's fortune had grown into the billions, and with that wealth came a shift in his public life. In 2003, he made a move that would define his global image for the next 2 decades. He purchased Chelsea Football Club in London for roughly £140 million. At the time, it seemed like an eccentric indulgence, a Russian billionaire buying a mid-table English football club. But Abramovich's investment transformed Chelsea into one of the most successful clubs in European football. Over nearly 2 decades, he poured billions of pounds into players, infrastructure, and coaching staff, and the club won an extraordinary haul of trophies, including multiple Premier League titles, FA Cups, and 2 UEFA Champions League crowns. For English football fans, Abramovich became a symbol of a new era, one where foreign billionaires could reshape the sport through sheer financial power. Alongside football, Abramovich built one of the most extravagant lifestyles the modern world had ever seen. He became famous for his collection of superyachts, vessels so large and technologically advanced that they were less like boats and more like floating small cities. His yacht Eclipse, at over 500 feet long, was for years considered one of the largest privately owned yachts in the world. Complete with 2 helicopter pads, multiple swimming pools, a missile defense system, and a submarine. Another vessel, the Solaris, nearly matched it in scale and luxury. He also owned private jets, sprawling estates in England, France, and the United States, and an art collection that included works by some of the most celebrated painters in history, acquired for sums that regularly made headlines in the art world. For years, Abramovich moved through this rarefied world with relative ease, a Russian billionaire, embraced by Western high society, courted by football executives, art dealers, and real estate agents alike. He held Russian citizenship, but as scrutiny of Kremlin-linked wealth increased in the 2010s, he also acquired Israeli citizenship, taking advantage of his Jewish heritage under Israel's law of return, and later Portuguese citizenship as well, diversifying his legal protections across multiple jurisdictions. It was a quiet, methodical hedging of bets, the kind of long-term thinking that had characterized his rise from the very beginning. But the world that Abramovich had so carefully built began to collapse in February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Western governments moved swiftly to target the wealthy individuals seen as close to the Kremlin, and Abramovich, despite his decades of carefully cultivated Western relationships, was near the top of the list. In March 2022, the United Kingdom placed him under sanctions, freezing his assets and describing him as an oligarch with long-standing ties to Vladimir Putin, including what officials characterized as privileged access to the Russian leader. The sanctions meant Chelsea could only operate under a special license that barred the club from selling new tickets, merchandise, or signing new players. The European Union and Canada soon followed with their own sanctions, freezing his assets across the continent. The consequences were immediate and dramatic. Abramovich, who had already been trying to sell Chelsea as pressure mounted, was now legally required to divest. In May 2022, the club he had transformed from a mid-table team into a European powerhouse was sold for approximately £4.25 billion, with the proceeds directed toward humanitarian causes for victims of the war in Ukraine, a condition imposed as part of the sanctions framework. It was an extraordinary end to a 19-year chapter, the billionaire who had built one of football's great modern dynasties, forced out by the very war his home country had started. The turmoil extended beyond football and finance. In the early weeks of the war, Abramovich took on an unexpected role as an intermediary, reportedly participating in early negotiation efforts between Russian and Ukrainian officials. That involvement came with real danger. In March 2022, reports emerged, based on accounts from the Wall Street Journal and independent investigators, that Abramovich and members of the Ukrainian negotiating team had suffered a suspected poisoning during one of these meetings, though all those affected reportedly recovered, and their lives were not considered to be in danger. The episode, murky and never fully explained, only added to the aura of intrigue that had long surrounded him. Even his beloved yachts became targets of public anger. In March 2022, a group of Ukrainian sailors, many of them children, attempted to block Abramovich's superyacht Solaris from docking at the Turkish city of Bodrum, a striking image of ordinary citizens confronting the physical symbols of his fortune. His vessels, once emblems of untouchable luxury, spent much of the following years shuttling between the handful of ports still willing to host them, avoiding jurisdictions where they risked seizure. Stripped of easy access to Western banks, sporting institutions, and much of his old social standing, Abramovich did not simply accept the sanctions quietly. He mounted an extensive legal campaign to fight back. In 2023, he formally challenged the European Union's sanctions before the General Court of the Court of Justice of the European Union, with his legal team arguing that he had been targeted not because of specific evidence, but simply because he was one of the most famous Russian businessmen in the world. The case dragged on for years, working its way through appeals and hearings, a slow-motion legal battle over whether decades of business success and Kremlin proximity amounted to genuine complicity or simply guilt by association. By 2025, his legal team had scored a partial victory, successfully petitioning the EU to adjust the terms of his designation following a favorable court ruling. Though the broader sanctions campaign against him continued into 2026, with fresh hearings and legal challenges still unfolding, despite everything, Abramovich's fortune, though diminished and heavily frozen, remained immense. Forbes estimated his net worth at roughly $2 billion even amid the sanctions era, a figure that placed him far below his pre-war peak, but still comfortably among the wealthiest people on earth. Much of that wealth remained locked away in frozen accounts, untouchable yachts, and contested legal proceedings, wealth that existed on paper but could no longer move freely through the channels that had once made him one of the most connected billionaires in the world. What makes Abramovich's story so compelling is not simply the scale of his wealth, but the arc of it. A boy orphaned in provincial Russia, who exploited the collapse of an empire to build one of the great fortunes of his generation, who used that fortune to buy legitimacy and glamour in the capitals of the West, and who ultimately watched much of that legitimacy evaporate when the geopolitical winds shifted. He built palaces of luxury on the open sea, funded football glory that delighted millions of fans, and quietly wielded influence in rooms most people will never see. But he also became a case study in how quickly the trappings of Western acceptance can be stripped away when politics demands it. Today, Abramovich lives a far more guarded and dispersed existence than the jet-setting, trophy-collecting mogul of the 2000s and 2010s. He moves between jurisdictions that remain open to him, manages a sprawling and complicated legal defense across multiple courts, and watches from a distance as the football club that once bore his imprint continues under new ownership. His story remains unfinished, a saga still being written in courtrooms in Luxembourg and Brussels, as much as in boardrooms and shipyards. Whatever the final chapters hold, the arc of Roman Abramovich's life stands as one of the most extraordinary case studies of the post-Soviet era, proof of how fast fortunes can be built in the chaos of history, and how fast the world can turn on even its most powerful players when that history turns again.